Seamlessly done. Thanks, Paul. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see many of you. I'm Christopher Stacey. I'm Director of Support and Development at Clinks, and it's good to see so many of you here this afternoon. This event is part of Clinks' Evidence Library series, where we give people in the sector the chance to ask questions of leading academics, such as Louise, who I'll introduce in a second, talking about the latest research on an important topic. And we're delighted to have Louise Ridley from Northumbria University with us this afternoon. She previously taught at University of Teesside for 15 years, and she's worked with a variety of different organisations providing support to vulnerable groups. And she's got particular interest in arts, in criminal justice, prison mental health, and crucially for this afternoon, older people in prison. This is quite a sad moment for me actually this afternoon, because we've been doing these events for the last couple of years, particularly me and Russell Webster, who's here helping with the Q&A section in a moment. And it's my last one of these, because I'll be moving on from Clinks at the end of next week. So I just wanted to mark that point and say how brilliant it's been to do these evidence library events. And I'm sure they will continue to be as good as they have been, if not even better in the future. So what we're going to do over the next hour or so is we're going to first hear from Louise, and I have some questions that I'm going to pose to her. And then we'll take about 20-25 minutes for that. And then we try and keep a good chunk of time for questions from you all. So if you have a question at any point, feel free to pop it in the chat. And as Russell has introduced himself in the chat to explain, he's going to take us through that Q&A section. And that's always a really interesting part of these conversations. So before I turn to you, Louise, I just wanted to reflect on why we're doing this, and today of all days, actually. So Russell kindly pointed out that the Nuffield Trust today published their latest report into prisoner health, and using hospital data to look at the healthcare needs of older prisoners in England, which I think was really timely. And so it's a really long anticipated area of development, I think, and we'll maybe explore that a little bit more in some of the questions. So Louise, am I okay to turn to you, and we'll kick off if that's okay? So could you just start by telling us a bit about why the numbers of older people in prison have risen so much in over the last 20 years?
Yes. Hello, and thank you everyone for coming along today. I think there's a number of different reasons. Across the Western world, we've seen a rise in prison populations, and we've seen a rise particularly of those over 50. So it's the over 50s. There's a great debate about what constitutes older as well in the research area, and there's many people who use 55, 60. But for the purposes of my research, and I think it's agreed concept now really nationally that we use 50, and I know for most of us 50, isn't old, but talking about the Nuffield work, etc., we know that people age as well more in prison, so people often have 10-year plus health inequalities in prison given their actual age. So we use 50, and I think when we look around, we look across the world, we see, at the moment there's 12 million people in prison. We've got 84,500 people in prison in England and Wales today. 17% of that number are over the age of 50. So 17%, that's a huge number. And I think the reasons for this rise are complex, and they're different depending on what countries you look at. I think for England and Wales, demographic changes, people are living longer. We've got a lot of older men who were sentenced for sexual offences post the Savile case. We saw a huge peak in the numbers of men going to prison in the years after the Savile case, which is starting to decline slightly now. Changes in sentencing practice. We like to send people to prison for a long time in this country. We've also got a huge number of older people who have been recalled to prison as well. And the average sentence now in this country is about 55.3 months, and that's about 2 years longer than it was in 2008. So we're sending more people to prison for longer periods of time. And on top of that, if we look at the projections for 2026, we expect the prison population to grow by a quarter, and we expect those over 50 to grow at the same speed as well. And when we look at our prison population, we can see that 44% of men over 50 are there, and they're convicted of sexual offences. So this makes this population quite different, you know, if we compare to looking at the rest of the population as well. And in addition to that, those over the age of 80, about 92% of people who are sentenced at the age of over 80 are sentenced at that age, so it's a first-time offence, and that creates a huge new set of complexities really for the prison service.
Thanks, Louise. I was particularly struck there from what you described about the rising numbers, and I guess something that you put in the evidence library briefing that you wrote about how the needs of older men might be being deprioritized when they often pose little problem in the way that prisons run in terms of good order and the running. What do you think needs to happen then, given the kind of case that you just set out for rising numbers? What needs to happen to help shift that focus towards the needs of this group, not least because I guess of the challenges that you've just described in terms of the kind of specific types of offences and clients that represents?
I mean, obviously the national strategy, which we've been waiting for, you know, for a long time, and I believe, you know, that we should be hearing a bit more about later this year. There has to be national strategy, because I think currently what we've got is a piecemeal approach. So you've got different prisons doing different things. Some are doing really well, some are doing, you know, not so well. And set against that, you know, there's no kind of support for staff. You know, I think staff sometimes come into this this area of work, and they don't expect perhaps to see lots of older men in prison. They don't expect that to be part of their job. So I think there has to be clear strategy, but also within that there has to be some flexibilities that prisons can work, you know, independently with the resources that are there within their communities. You know, so not to set the kind of the criteria and the guidelines too strictly. And I think when you actually work with this group of men, and it's predominantly men, and when you ask them what they want, it's not always what you think they might say. You know, some of the things that they actually want to make life better, more bearable while they're in prison are really, you know, minor things. You know, it's not the huge kind of impactful things that we might think of. But I think in addition to that as well, we need to be careful not to treat everybody the same. Not everybody over 50 will have the same needs as another person over 50. And I think that takes me back to the fact that we're talking about a lot of these men who have been convicted of sex offenders. And we know that, you know, managing the VP population can be a bit more difficult. And from our research, we found that the men who were in prison for sex offences aged more quickly, if that makes sense, aged more quickly, and they were more happy or comfortable with that label of being older, because I think it gave them a sense of more security and safety within the prison as well. But I think we have to think carefully about how we approach what we do with them, because it's not one size fits all, because, you know, this is a complex group of individuals. But I really believe that there has to be flexibility for local governors, staff to make their decisions on their local level, because no one population is going to be the same in any prison.
And I think that goes nicely into the next question I had, because you talked about the national strategy, and it's just maybe worth pausing here to share, because I'm sure lots of people here have an interest in this area. And so Clinks shared a few weeks ago something in our weekly light lunch email about what is now being called the aging population strategy, and that is being developed. And for anybody that's on this meeting that wants to find out more about that, I'll post something in the chat of some contact details of somebody in the Ministry of Justice that you can make contact with. I think it's fair to say that it isn't, the publication of that strategy isn't as imminent as we might have thought it might have been, and so there is work to be done this year to develop that. But I think it means that there is an opportunity for those that have an interest in this area to really reach out and get involved in that. Clinks is part of an external steering group alongside a few other organisations, but if people have their own interest in it, I'll pop some details in the chat. But Louise, I guess you touched on the flexibility for local governors as a good example of maybe the tone of that kind of strategy, what needs to be in it. But given how in the briefing you highlighted how this sort of came as a bit of a shock for the prison system, the rising numbers, and that lack of a national strategy has meant that we're kind of the system's been quite limited in how it responds strategically. What do you think? Are there any other things that you think needs to be in that strategy, and what do you think will help make it a success?
Yeah, I think there has to be a lead. I think, there has to be a national lead as well for the prisons, a bit like there was for women. I'm thinking about David Ramsbottom's time when he highlighted the fact there was no lead for women within the prison estate. I think there needs to be a lead from the top, and I think if there's no lead from the top, then you won't get the buy-in as you go down. And there also needs to be a lead from each prison that has an older prisoner population. And our research has shown that if we have a good lead within the prison, then things really begin to happen, and there can be some autonomy there, and work with your population, because your population will give you the answers. I mean, when we started doing the work in our prison, we asked the men what they wanted, and they came back, they wanted duvets. It was cold, in the winter. We live in the northeast, it was cold in the winter, and they wanted a different catalogue for clothes, because the catalogue that the men got in prison didn't suit their kind of choice of clothes. They wanted to have more time out of the cell, because obviously these men were of retirement age, but some of them still wanted to work, so they wanted to find somewhere they could be employed and have their time used successfully. In addition to that, they wanted a social time where they could be themselves and listen to music of their era, and play sort of board games together, do sports, and just have that sense that they weren't in prison. But I also think one of the biggest concerns that they bring with them, and this has to be addressed by any strategy on a national, local level, is health. So the Nuffield report today is really timely, and much of what was said in the Nuffield report supports the evidence we're bringing back from the local prisons, that men do not have the equivalence of care in prison. They don't have access to the same level of healthcare. Sometimes ridiculous situations where the healthcare might be half a mile away, and they physically can't get there, or they go and wait, and actually it closes before they're seeing a healthcare practitioner, or they're waiting far too long, and trying to take their own teeth out, etc. So, and I know that's not just relevant to this population, but again, going back to the Old and Quiet report by the HMIP, I think they're always last on the list, and we need to move away from the fact that they always are last on the list. So if there's staff shortages, it'll be the wings that are closed down because they are old and quiet, they don't object, and we need to stop doing that. Another example is accommodation. In the prison that we worked in, the older prisoners were put in the oldest accommodation, the most unsuitable accommodation, because it was the closest to the perimeter fence where the drugs were coming in. So they weren't at risk of bringing drugs in. So they were at the bottom of the pile and ended up in the poorest accommodation. Physically, prisons aren't set up, are they, for men with any walking or physical disabilities. We had scenarios where some men couldn't actually even go to get their meals from the hatch because they were using walking aids, etc. So all these things have to be addressed on a localized level, depending on the population that you have in your prison at that time. So going back to what we need to do, yes, a national strategy, but yes, local delivery where you can work with partners, whoever's available, your experts in the area who can provide things at short notice, who are set up ready and willing to go. Yeah.
And I think just building on that point, and so some people here today, and I certainly thought this when I was reading through the paper that you wrote, when I was reading through it the other day, might be wondering which prisons do you think are doing their best to step up to this challenge in the absence of perhaps a wider national strategy? Which ones maybe have an older person lead, which is being effective? Can you maybe share an example or two of examples that you've come across in your research that you think are worth sharing?
Yeah, and I'll give you the example of the prison that the research is based on, because this prison began to see a rise in the number of older prisoners, and they were taken by surprise. As you said, sorry, I didn't answer that part, about the kind of surprise. I think the surprise about the rising number of prisoners is really that that over the years we've been pretty poor predicting we're not very good at much information about backgrounds, age, etc. of prisoners. And I think the surprise came as a result of people not being clear about what was going to happen in terms of practice and sentencing policy, and I think that's across most of the Western world. So the prison that we did the research in actually acknowledged that suddenly these people were coming through their gates, that they weren't prepared for this population, and this population was creating kind of complexity when they arrived because their problems were complex. It was complex because staff weren't able to respond to them. And what they did was relatively simple. So they set up a steering group within the prison of interested parties. And I think that's really important. People involved have to have an interest. Don't force staff to work with this age group if it's not something they want to do. So interested parties. And then we began, and I became part of this group because I was doing some of the research in the prison. And then we looked out to the community to see what we could mirror inside the prison that was being done in the community for older people. And our first port of call was Age UK. It's kind of an obvious port of call, isn't it? And as a result of that relationship, and this wasn't easy, this took a number of years, and keeping people involved and bringing people in, and involving people in the prison, like resettlement teams, etc., wasn't easy. You're talking about now sort of seven or 8 years of work. So we brought Age UK in. And then we set up a group with prisoners, so a peer group of prisoners who then told us what they wanted. And I think everyone was surprised by what they wanted. It wasn't a lot. But then when they began to talk about some of the barriers, some of it was huge. Some of them couldn't get outside the wing. There was no walking aid for them to actually get any fresh air. So things like seats in the exercise yard for men to actually get out. We got grab rails leading out of the building so they could go outside. And we works within the prison, but then we obviously worked with Age UK in terms of finding support for all the things the men were concerned about: pensions, what was going to happen to the money outside of prison, thinking about social care. When we started it, social care provision was really poor in prison. And then we thought about all the other things that the men, advocacy, all those different things. And then the other thing that we did with this project is we set up a day centre, Inside Out Club, which was probably the best thing we did. And the men really now run that. They run it because it's been set up for such a long time. They look forward to it. It's every week. And they bring biscuits as prizes for quizzes. They have carpet bowls. And it's a point in their week where they can just be themselves. They listen to music. There's all sorts of things. But as part of that, we brought outside speakers in as experts to answer some of the queries they had. So I suppose what I'm trying to say, it's not rocket science. And that's what frustrates me about the national strategy. It's not rocket science. It's working collaboratively with existing experts who were there ready to find solutions to the problems of this population. One of the biggest concerns of this group is resettlement. This is something that the men, talk about because of perhaps the complexity of their crimes. They may not be able to go back to their family homes, and the thoughts of going to kind of hostel accommodation is really quite challenging and distressing. And I think any strategy needs to get the resettlement part right, because these men start thinking about resettlement far sooner than any of the younger men. It's a huge issue, and we really need to make sure we get that right, and we start quickly with that.
And I mean, I've just seen maybe an example of in another prison, a good example, which kind of links to, I guess, the question I was struck by what you were saying about Age UK, and I guess from your experience of working with them and other voluntary sector organisations, what do you think some of the kind of key successes are that they've achieved? What challenges do you think remain? Because I know that there'll be quite a few people here this afternoon that work in voluntary organisations that might be wanting to support older men in prison more, but may not necessarily know about some of the kind of successes, but also some of the challenges.
I mean, I think some of the key successes are getting to know the population. I mean, getting to know the population differently to how prison staff might get to know the population. And that's partly because prison staff don't have that time, energy, to spend the time with prisoners like they used to. I mean, we've got acknowledged staffing shortages, all these developments. We're asking for a time of austerity, the last few years as well, and reduction in prison finances. So we're aware of that. So it's not an expensive venture. I think we can say that, everything we've done, we've created in this prison, which has since been rolled out to all the prisons in the North East. So this is something that's been incredibly successful. And I think it's bringing experts in, it's bringing people who are different, who've got a different vision to prison staff, but also can help support prison staff as well. I mean, I think that's a real huge area that's lacking, that people working in prisons need to be supported in this area. Not everybody understands the complexities of aging and dementia, etc. like that. But I think it's about developing relationships. And, I spent a long time developing relationships with the men who this research is based on, and gaining their trust is quite difficult. But I think the staff, Age UK staff in particular, did that. And they really generated the peer support groups as well. I think there was a level of trust there where they could, generate peer support groups as well, and became a conduit to also to speak to sort of management about what these men really needed. And I think there's also, a worry that we don't treat them all the same. I mean, I remember having a long conversation with Peter Clark about this, the previous Chief Inspector of Prisons, and it was about creating units for older people, so not putting too many old people in one unit. And there was an IMB report, H&P Norwich, that talked about a unit there when they said that Norwich, it actually had become like an old people's home with no life and no visitors. So I think we also have to be careful about what sort of environment we create within the prison, before we start putting those external resources in. There has to be the right mix of individuals.
And it's interesting you go there, because I was going to ask you about that. So this will be my last question. So it's an invitation to everybody else that's here to think about questions that you have. I know there's a couple there already, but if you have questions for Louise, the moment will be coming where you get to ask them. But look, Louise, you referenced that about Peter Clark, so former Chief Inspector. And I was particularly struck by the reference that you made to that in the paper about his need to give thought to how to housing men who are elderly and frail and in something akin to a care home with additional security. And I guess I was reflecting on the opposite end of the spectrum of what we've got with children and young people in the criminal justice system. And I guess I'm interested in what you think. That is that something that should be considered? What risks come with that? What does the evidence tell us about what that should and shouldn't look like?
I think it's a difficult one, and I think it's possibly the hardest question to answer, because I think, if we acknowledge that we're talking about this group and we say 44% of these men have committed sexual related offences, then you end up in an arena which has its challenges. But I think there are cheaper and more, and cheaper should appeal to the Ministry of Justice. There's cheaper and more compassionate solutions that should be available. We look at the countries, Canada, Belgium, Germany, they are all doing something akin to what you said there, Chris, that they're developing specialised housing units for older prisoners without that kind of, reinforcement around it. And I think there's a lot of the population that don't need the security that prisons provide. And in fact, I'm sure that other people work this group will probably feel the same way, that not many of these men don't want to leave prison, you know, so that they're not going to be an escape risk, because actually for them this is their security. So we need to think about that. We also need to add in, and I haven't mentioned this so far, but we need to think about, you know, health and end of life care as well as part of that. And you know, that not just the impact it has on the men, but also on staffing as well, you know, how that is managed. And often that's very difficult to manage in our current provision. So I think we really need to think long and hard about that. And the numbers are rising, and they will continue to rise as we send more people to prison, people who will end their lives in prison. So you know, I think we need to have more conversations. It doesn't help with the media. I mean, we've got you know, the media give a very kind of distorted view of prisons and prisoners, and I think, you know, the more we can move away from that false rhetoric that comes out in some of those reports, the better. So I think we need to have more frank and open discussions about the realities, and if we can just start with cost, you know, we could do something hugely more effective and cheaper. However, you know, I've had this conversation with many of my colleagues working in health as well, and you know, and sometimes you go into the older prisoner units that we work into, and it's a much more kind of energized environment than an old people's home. So we've created something that's quite lively and full of energy, and you certainly don't want to go down the route where you do mirror, you know, something that is going to lack all that sort of lively and all the kind of things that are going on on those wings. So yeah, I think it's a conversation to be had, but I think it's, and Peter Clark was really honest about it, and he said exactly that, you know, that you have to balance that kind of, obviously the risk over the kind of the compassion, but start thinking sort of differently about the process of housing older people.
I think it feels like very much about the process of thinking, as opposed to kind of, it feels like we've ended up in the place that we've ended up by almost by accident. It's not been designed to be like that. And I think it's really striking. I'm really interested in those examples that you gave of overseas in other places. That can help kind of visualize and bring to life what that might look like. They were my questions for you. So thank you, Louise. That was brilliantly done to answer, I think, 6 questions, really in quite some detail, but without the risk of going too over. Speaking to academics sometimes is a risk. So thank you, Louise. That was brilliant. I'm going to hand over to Russell now, who will take us through the Q&A. So please get your questions in. Russell, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, do please pop your questions in the chat. We're going to start off with a question from Simon Scott. Simon's researching long-term prisoners at the moment. Simon, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Russell. Oh, my camera just seems to have gone off for some reason, sorry. Actually, I was just, before I asked my question, I was just reminded of you know, a couple of small prisons that used to exist, like Kingston and Shepton Mallet and other places. And actually Sea Wing at Shepton Mallet, the ground floor was a kind of almost a palliative care wing. You know, the vast majority of men on there were dying of cancer, but there were other younger men who also lived on the wing that gave a lot of peer support and things. But that kind of thing always seems to come about almost through, you know, local circumstances and people that really care locally, almost kind of accidentally. So it would be nice to think the national strategy would address that kind of thing, but I guess we'll see. My question actually was quite a different subject. I was going to ask Louise what she thought about kind of 2 aspects of employment in prison and how it relates to older people. So one aspect is the kind of employment options and training options which are available, which kind of defaults a little bit to, you know, rail work or bricklaying and things like that, which not necessarily suitable for older men, and how that impacts on training options and education available in prison, but also the notion that employment is so much seen as a protective factor with regards to risk, particularly by the parole board and probation, and that for someone who's retired, you know, they could almost be seen as a risk because they're not working, because they're older. And so the kind of desistance model doesn't necessarily fit in with that older man, if you like. is that enough of a question for you to kind of like pick up that subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the kind of lack of preparation of prisons, you know, that when these older populations started coming forward, they were very quick to sort of retire them all, because, you know, prisons are very much geared up for young men, aren't they? Focused around, you know, drug, alcohol, rehabilitation, education, you know, learning a trade. And I think for some of the men that we worked with, you know, they weren't ready to retire, so they found, you know, some jobs sort of doing the food parcels, etc., and they had other kind of activities. And when we developed some of the provisions there, we had hens. They would look after the hens, and they would take on the responsibility of doing the washing. So they would find, you know, work there, but there was very little formalized work for them, and certainly no education. And I think psychologically and physically, you know, for some of the men, it was incredibly aging, that process, because they stopped being active in every shape and sense of the word. And I mean, that's the other thing. I think that prisons actually propel that sense of aging, you know, not just by the lack of exercise, natural light, etc., but by sort of demoting people and retiring them off at that age. So I think it's a really interesting point, and that certainly has to be something about national strategy. And as you say, you know, in terms of parole, etc., you know, it's really vital. And there's very little provision unless it's provided for by that prison, you know, thinking outside of the box, literally, and developing kind of work for that age group.
Yeah, that seems to be the issue to me, that where anything works well, it works well because there's some point of excellence locally. And I think I read the statement on what they expect a national strategy to deliver, and it didn't really fill me full of excitement. It was kind of like almost like a mandatory minimum.
Yeah.
So I worry a little bit that the national strategy will be a kind of, you know, very low kind of mandatory minimum level of care that it you know, prescribes.
I agree, and I think that the priority still for this group of prisoners is still so low. I agree. I'm not optimistic that it will do even the things that we've been able to do with this set of prisons, with a very low budget and a set of really committed individuals, ranging from, you know, academics to student volunteers to Age UK, and the people that Age UK have brought in. And yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Simon. On that kind of subject, Louise, if the best that we can help for is a recognition of the needs from the national strategy and some minimums, and perhaps a framework in which better work can happen. I wondered if you know of any examples or would like to comment on the idea of kind of peer advocates. I'm drawing here on my own experience of my dad, who's 91 and has just gone into a care home. And all through his life, my dad had no problem telling anyone, you know, exactly what he thought, or, you know, where something wasn't right. And he's really lost that confidence recently. So I called him up in the morning. I said, "How are you?" And he says, "Oh, bloody terrible. They brought me the wrong breakfast." So I said, "What did you tell him?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, why didn't you? You know, you've never had any problem before." And I wonder if peer support is going to be one of the key things, if that can be formalized, and actually that role of peers saying, you know, to authorities, "Well, look, you know, John's not eating, but he's not eating because he can't get, you know, he's scared to get to the servery without having a fall, etc." Anyway, I think I've made my point and I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, I think it's really valuable, and it certainly was a huge part of how the house block ran. You know, that men would be advocates for other men. You know, identifying perhaps that somebody hadn't been out of the cell for a considerable length of time, which staff hadn't noticed. Identifying that people's behaviour was changing. You know, talking about early stage dementia, etc. And I think it's absolutely huge. And men who were voices for other men who just didn't feel able or didn't want to speak out, you know, about issues. And I think it's huge. And as I said to you, you know, about the day centre that runs, that really is run by that set of group. That is peer run, supported by the Age UK project worker. But I think it's really underused. And of course, there's also the caveat about the anxiety that about risk as well. But I think we have to really try and get around that with this group and see it for the benefits that it can really provide. And it's funny you saying that, Russell, because at the point I was doing this research, my dad went into a home, and I remember thinking that actually my dad would be better off in the prison environment, because there was more things going on there, and people did have advocacy, and it was just so important, really. And I think we need to find strategies and ways of developing that more and use it more effectively. And the other thing with older people as well is that you've got groups of men who are articulate and intelligent because they have had certain jobs in their lives, and they are, they're often very skilled individuals. So we've got a population there that we could use much more constructively than we do at the moment. Yeah.
Lovely, thanks, Louise. I'm still keen to encourage people to put questions in the chat, or I think there's not that many of us. If people want to raise a hand and ask a question direct. Another issue, I think, if we think that the national strategy may well set some minimum standards, is today's report that we've referred to by the Nuffield Foundation, who analysed all the data on hospital visits for older prisoners. One of the things I was surprised to find was that high blood pressure came up, not as being, not because so many people from prison were being diagnosed with it, but because of the opposite. There was a low level of diagnosis, which suggested that that need wasn't being picked up at all. And I wondered if there is a role, given what we know about prison accelerating the aging process, for perhaps everyone over 70 having an assessment around possible dementia needs and that sort, because it seems to me that minimum standards in healthcare, we know we've had great uptake of the Hep C kind of vaccinations, in a completely different area in prisons, because that's been driven and set as a target. I wondered if there are things like that which, over a weekend, almost it's the Hep C model is that a team goes in over the weekend and blitzes the whole population, offers the whole prison population the opportunity to be tested. And I wonder if those sorts of intensive things, clearly we know that health trusts have got statutory duty and are very interested in health equalities. So again, whether there might be a way of, improving matters.
Yeah, I just saw Chris's comment there in the chat about Joe Peterson might know something about this. I need to fess up that Joe Peterson is my sidekick. He's my project lead in the prisons we're talking about. So Joe Peterson knows a huge amount about this, but the health issue is vital, and I think there's very little equivalence of care at all for this group of men, and as I said, I think prison obviously makes their conditions worse. One of the things that Joe did is set up a gym, so that men who'd never been to the gym now go to the gym, and it's a set time for them to go over 50s. There's no other people there, and it's been one of the most successful things that Joe's been able to develop, and it's really helped with the sedentary lifestyles that these men will lead. And I think it's got them to be more kind of concerned about their own health and ask more questions about it, because I think there is a sense that people are, fearful about coming forward about health related issues as well, or people don't listen, when they're actually saying that something's wrong. And I think the thing about dementia, a lot of the research around dementia, if you have a relative with dementia, you begin to identify the changes in those behaviour because you know that person really well. I think when you're in prison and people don't know you and don't know your behaviours, it's often seen that you've been obstructive or difficult, and actually really you're suffering, from the start of dementia, which, we have seen that occurring within the places that we work. So, yeah.
Thanks, Louise. I'm still trying to drive up some, encourage people not to be shy in asking questions. I know there's quite a lot of expertise. Here we go. Sarah Burwood's dug me out of trouble at the
good. Thank you, Sarah.
Perfect moment. Sarah, would you like to ask your question to Louise?
Yes, I can do. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm new to this. I've only been in post for 2 or 3 months or so. But one of the things that seems to be arising is, as you were talking about, release from prison for older prisoners, and particularly links with local authorities around sort of, you know, suitable accommodation and sort of, you know, just anything on that really around how to best prepare people for release, how to link with local authorities, how to sort of engage so that people are appropriately placed on release.
Yes. I mean, again, I think that has to be part of the joined up thinking, doesn't it? These people need to be involved in, you know, steering groups, whatever local prisons want to do. And I think steering groups are a good idea because you can bring on board social care, healthcare, etc., and begin to kind of work, obviously, with offender managers. But again, it has to be sort of done early. And I think if you bring people into the prisons as well, they can kind of work with the populations and see what they're dealing with, because I still think obviously there's all that stigma, Sarah, but aware of it, you know, that local authorities don't want to house these people. I mean, obviously some of the prisoners have to go into different areas anyhow, and it often is hostel accommodation, but I think it's about bringing people on board with it. I mean, even when we started with social care, they were reluctant to come in and work, and once that kind of, it's not perfect, but once you get it off the ground and people come in and see what they're dealing with, you know, I think you alleviate some of those kind of fantasies or worries about what prison populations are going to be like. So yeah, I think work with them from the outset if possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful. It's yeah. Okay. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Louise. Well, in the work you've done, I wondered if we've talked a lot about the positive peer power, the benefits of that. But there does seem, again, looking at the Nuffield report, there seems to be a sense amongst some frail older prisoners, you know, a concern that they didn't want to be labelled as frail in case they became targets for bullying, for having the medications taken off them, and, you know, canteen, etc. I wonder if you'd like to share your experience around that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had experience of that where you've got the population mix kind of wrong, you know, where people have come onto wings that aren't really suitable individuals for that wing, and it really very quickly does disrupt the kind of the whole, you know, smooth running, and again, but the peer thing worked effectively there because it was the people who were part of the prisoner steering group who came forward and actually said that this was happening. So it worked well, and they were advocates in terms of changing the sort of the population. It's really difficult, isn't it, to get any dynamic of a group of people work well, and you're never sure how things are going to really pan out. But I think it is important to get that mix right, you know, to get the right people in any housing units for it to work effectively. But again, you know, not to have it kind of, again, as we said before, you know, all very elderly people, because that can really change the whole dynamic and the liveliness of the unit at that point. Yeah, so yeah, I think it can work both ways. I think and we also had situations as well, you know, where people were offering to help for all the wrong reasons. You know, we've got to be honest about this. People would say they wanted to be peers and help, but it was actually for all the wrong reasons. So, you know, that there is a risks always associated with that, but I don't think it's a good enough reason not to kind of develop any time peer mentoring schemes and peer support schemes.
Yes, I suppose it's that always the challenge with peer, isn't it? That there is huge value in it, but there's always a temptation to do it as a cheaper option.
Yes, yeah, and not invest.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same with staff teams as well. You know, the right staff make a huge difference. You know, the staff who will be advocates for the men who've got time to listen. You know, that makes a huge difference as well. And leadership, always leadership.
So can I ask you, if you were, God forbid, Dominic Raab and in charge of it all, what would your top three, you know, what, given we are where we are, we know that there are some more public resources coming, but not as much as we would like. What would, you know, be top of your list for the strategy when it emerges?
Definitely lead. Somebody who you know, the book stops with them, some responsibility, and then for each prison who has an aging population to have a lead, somebody who carries this, takes it forward. and that there's a remit for them to work with the community, with people who are the experts in the community, and even, you know, the scenario that we're in now, you know, what's been rolled out in the 7 northeast prisons. It would be easy to share that. So I'll be happy to say to Dominic Rao, come and see what we've done. Come and see, you know, look at who we've used. People have given their time freely. I mean, my time's been given freely. We've used, I work in quite an eclectic department. We've used a lot of our students we've had art students and media students work with this group of prisoners who've done some fantastic, you know, things. They put on a whole day event where they showcased reading poetry, singing songs, and the students were able to gain a huge amount from it. So what I'm trying to say, you know, there's all these resources there that you can really chip into that won't cost you anything. And get the right staff in place. Think about where your units are in your prisons for elderly prisoners. Think about the proximity to healthcare. If you can't get them to healthcare, then take healthcare to them. Think about exercise, all the basic things. Think about if they're warm, if they feel safe, if they're stimulated in terms of work, activity, and think of an unlock policy. If your population aren't working, then let them out of the cells. You know, I mean, there's so many times that you find these men locked behind the door, and the isolation, you know, becomes even worse, and their inability to mix becomes even worse. And get resettlement right. Start resettlement much early with them. Talk to your outside providers. Bring them into see your population. And work with social care. And do the same with them. So everybody's got a buy-in. Let them come and see what they've got to deal with. And I think a lot of that stigma will be alleviated. Will go as a result of that.
Thanks, Louise. I think we've got time for one last question from Andrew Gray. Andrew, over to you.
Hello, yes. It wasn't necessary to raise it orally, but I will raise it orally. I'm Andrew Gray. I'm chair of what's affectionately known as PORSH, which is the Prison and Offender Research Network for Health and Social Care, based in the northeastern Yorkshire. And Louise is a member of our advisory board. So I'm supporting Team Ridley today.
Thank you, Andrew.
My question was really about the evaluation of different models for responding to the analysis, the diagnosis, if you like, that Louise has outlined. I know there are lots of different sorts of minor experiments going on in particular prisons, but I don't see any systematic evaluation or systematic review of their effects. It's not difficult to imagine, for example, one model that was mentioned was putting all the older prisoners on one wing. That turns it into a care home, and that's not necessarily beneficial for stimulation, for mental alertness and all the rest of it. On the other hand, if you put quite disabled elderly prisoners onto a wing with younger prisoners, there's obviously opportunities for exploitation. There are risks associated with that. Some basic issues arise in different models of responding to Louise's analysis. And I just wondered whether there's any evidence that could be added to your library which says what might work for whom in what circumstances.
I mean, I did a talk recently, and the amount of people who got in touch afterwards who were doing sort of small things in prisons, you know, which making a huge difference. And by using the word small, I'm not sort of talking about the significance of small things that were making a difference. And I think there has to be an evidence library. And I myself have written to the person who's the contact for the national strategy, and they haven't responded, or they said they'll get back in touch. But one of the things I said was that there was all these things being done. Could we have some way of collecting this information and use it as evidence of good practice? And I haven't had a response to that. So I think the only way to do it really is you know, for people to get in touch with me if they're doing things, and we can try and do it collectively. And it's really interesting, Andrew, when you talk about the idea of obviously putting all prisoners together or spreading them out. It takes you back, doesn't it, to the discussion 1960s about containment or dispersal. It's, you know, it's the same argument about whether we put everybody together or we disperse them. You know, and I think for some groups of people it might work better if they're all together, but for other individuals it might be better if they're mixed. But it's got to be a conversation to have, and it's got to be a conversation we have now before any national strategies develop, because I think it's the most important thing about what we do is how we house older people in prison. Before you get anything else right, if that's wrong, then nothing else will work at all. If they're not happy or safe in the environment, then nothing you do will work beyond that. But yeah, I think your point as well about, you know, an evidence library is really a good idea.
Thanks, Louise. I'm going to sneak one mini question in before going back to Chris, which just, I know that you teach a comparative penology course, and I wondered if there are other countries that do it better.
Well, it's like some of the ones I mentioned about Canada and Germany and Belgium, and what they have started to build are purpose-built units where you have accessibility issues that are resolved, access to showers, you know, to baths for people men who need different kind of ways of washing. All those things are addressed. Accessibility visits as well, where there's not such restrictions around visitation, so that kind of contact with family, and taking it away from the prison environment, taking away that stigma for families to stay in touch with people who might have committed sexual related offences, etc. So I think they're all really good examples. In the US, they have this very strange thing where they have little villages where people who are ex-sex offenders will all go and live in, you know, a particular type of village which is far away from other towns and cities. I'm not sure that's something that, you know, we could follow suit, but and interestingly, if in Japan obviously is suffering a real crisis in the number of elderly going to prison as a result of the fact they don't have any benefits, they don't have a pension. So many people in Japan are putting themselves in prison. So Japan are now beginning to think of having community-based like housing units, really. And you know, and although we say 44% of our prison population, men over 50, commit sex offences, that means 56% haven't. And you know, and I think sometimes we forget about that. Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Louise. Thanks for answering all those questions, and I'll hand us back over to Chris now.
Thanks, Russell. Just if I can just reflect a little bit on, I think a lot of this discussion is focused on, quite rightly, some of the challenges, opportunities, risks associated with a national strategy. And I guess I would just reflect to everybody here that it does feel like there is some work being done and still an opportunity to influence that. And so I'd encourage everybody who has an interest to engage. I posted earlier on the person in the MOJ to contact about that. I think that point about research of the outcomes of some of the kind of initiatives, that the question that Andrew asked, I think that does present an argument to that strategy that suggests there should be some investment in testing some different approaches and a commitment to then evaluating them. That would seem to me to be a positive step forward, actually, in a way that you see different approaches being tested and a commitment to doing that. So that's something that you then get buy-in from prisons that feel like they can sort of support that. I'm really grateful to you, Louise. Thank you. That was a brilliant discussion over the last hour or so. A huge thank you to both you coming this afternoon and sharing your expertise, but also for the effort that you put into writing the paper for Clinks's Evidence Library in the first place. And I think I would echo Andrew's point about more evidence about this and other areas. That was the idea behind Clinks building this evidence library. It isn't meant to be kind of one-off attempts at different subjects. It's to try and garner more support for more evidence in different areas. So thank you, and thank you to everyone that joined this afternoon. We will be getting a copy of the video available online to share soon. So if you've got colleagues that you think might be interested in hearing the discussion that you've heard this afternoon, then please do share it. In the meantime, if I can ask you to do one thing that will take a couple of moments. If we were all in the same physical room, we would stop you from leaving the room before you did this, and we obviously can't. But it's really helpful for us at Clinks to get feedback on the events and discussions that we have. So my colleague Paul has literally, as I hoped, posted a link to a very quick feedback form, which if you could just click and then take 2 minutes once you've logged off this to just share your thoughts, because we're really interested. I know Russell and I talk a lot about other things that we could look at as part of the evidence library and how to continue to develop it. So please do share those through that. Otherwise, thank you again to you, Louise. Thank you, Russell, and to Paul behind the scenes for making this happen. We'll have other ones coming up in the near future, so keep an eye out on our website for those. And in the meantime, thank you all for joining and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.